What if death was never the harshest punishment Chris Watts could face? What if the real sentence was being forced to keep breathing? Chris Watts was never sent to death row. The court chose another path, one officials described as more humane. But if you step inside his reality today, it becomes clear why many believe mercy was never part of the equation. He was placed in a world where time doesn't move forward, it collapses inward. Not long after his transfer, the pressure became unbearable. He called his attorney, his voice unsteady, repeating the same sentence again and again. "I just want to get out of here." That call wasn't about freedom. It was proof that the punishment had already done its job. No release date, no end point, no noise, except his own thoughts circling endlessly. This is what happens when the justice system decides that death is too easy, and living becomes the real penalty. Welcome to True Crime Mysteries HD. Thank you for being here. Before we go further, let us take a moment to pray. We pray for Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico. May their souls rest in eternal peace. May comfort and strength surround those who love them. Amen. If you agree, type Amen in the comments. For more intense and unforgettable true crime stories, make sure you're subscribed. And before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, South Africa, Australia. Let's see how far this story reaches. Stay with us, because what comes next may change how you understand justice forever. A steel door slams shut. The echo hangs in the air longer than it should. Inside that sound is the reality of a man who has lost everything, not just his freedom, but his ability to escape the past. Every morning, Chris Watts wakes up in a 6 by 9 foot cell. The lights never fully turn off. The walls offer no answers. This isn't death. It's something slower, something heavier. Some said execution would have been mercy. Instead, he was given time, endless time, inside a system designed to erase men quietly day by day. Years later, during a recorded phone call from inside prison walls, Watts whispered 6 words that shattered any illusion of peace. "I just want to get out of here." He wasn't talking about release. He was talking about survival. Those words reveal what life without parole truly means, an existence measured not in years, but in endurance. But to understand why that moment mattered, we have to return to where it all became final. The day the judge looked directly at him and told him he would never walk free again. The court acknowledged the request that the death penalty not be pursued and accepted the plea agreement. But the judge made one thing clear: this crime demanded nothing less than the maximum punishment. He described the acts as senseless, brutal, and deeply inhumane. The way the victims were disposed of weighed heavily on the court's decision. After more than a decade on the bench, the judge stated plainly that this was among the most vicious cases he had ever handled. Anything less than the harshest sentence, he said, would diminish the gravity of the crimes. Chris Watts was sentenced to life without parole for the murder of Shanann Watts. Life without parole for Bella. Life without parole for Celeste. Additional sentences followed for the unlawful termination of the pregnancy of baby Nico and for tampering with the bodies, each stacked one after another. No overlap. No mercy built into the timeline. November 19th, 2018 marked the day Colorado stopped following breaking news headlines and began witnessing justice unfold in real time. The courtroom felt heavy, almost claustrophobic. Silence filled every corner. Watts stood between 2 deputies, motionless, eyes vacant. Across the room, the families sat drained, grief etched into their faces. No one spoke. Only the soft rustle of paperwork and the judge's measured breathing broke the stillness. For months, this case had gripped the public. Now the story had reached its final chapter. Or so it seemed. In the end, everything was reduced to a handful of carefully chosen words from the bench. The ruling was short, final, and irreversible. 5 life sentences, stacked back to back, with no chance of parole. Justice's way of saying this journey would have no return. Each charge was read with deliberate clarity. The deaths of 3 children, the loss of an unborn life, and the actions taken afterward to conceal the truth. The judge's voice carried no anger, only resolve. This was not a punishment meant to end quickly, but one designed to stretch across an entire lifetime. When the gavel came down, there was no applause, no outburst, no release of emotion. Even the journalists lowered their cameras. The silence that followed didn't shatter, it settled, heavy and consuming. Chris Watts was escorted out without protest. The sound of restraints echoed softly against the courtroom's wooden walls as everyone inside seemed to breathe again for the first time in hours. Outside, crowds waited for something recognizable: rage, grief, closure. Instead, what lingered was an unspoken question. What does it mean to keep living when your freedom, your future, and even your identity have already been laid to rest? As the courtroom emptied, his story didn't conclude. It shifted into a place where calendars lose meaning, where each day stands alone as its own sentence. Soon, Colorado would decide he couldn't remain there. And that's where the real punishment would begin. Within 24 hours of sentencing, state officials moved swiftly. Chris Watts was no ordinary inmate. His name alone carried weight, one the entire state recognized, a face permanently etched into public memory. Keeping him in Colorado wasn't just dangerous, it was unworkable. In prison, information travels faster than locked doors, and some crimes mark a man permanently. Initially, he was placed in isolation while authorities considered their options. But threats continued to surface. Quiet warnings, coded messages, tension spreading through cell blocks. It became undeniable: Watts could not stay. The Department of Corrections authorized an interstate transfer, a rare step taken only when safety outweighs procedure. There was no announcement, no advance notice. One night, under heavy guard, he disappeared. By morning, he was hundreds of miles away at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, a prison designed for control, not comfort. His new life began without ceremony. New guards, new surroundings, the same endless sentence. This wasn't compassion. It was logistics. Colorado erased a liability. Wisconsin received a shadow. What awaited him wasn't protection, it was restructuring. Every system around him was designed to keep him alive, but separate. Secure but invisible. At Dodge, isolation wasn't temporary. It was the foundation. And as he entered that environment, Watts discovered that leaving danger behind didn't mean escaping it. It only meant learning how silence does its damage. The transfer passed quietly, but what followed was louder than any noise. At Dodge Correctional Institution, Chris Watts stepped into a world engineered to eliminate motion, sound, and human rhythm. His cell measured roughly 6 by 9 feet, a sealed box of concrete and steel. Not meant to punish, but to contain. The door remained locked for 23 hours a day. The remaining hour wasn't freedom, just a scheduled movement into another confined space. A fenced enclosure no larger than a parking spot. Every sound followed a pattern. The steady buzz of fluorescent lights. The sharp metallic scrape of a food tray sliding through a slot. Footsteps in the hallway arriving on schedule, never early, never late. Days blurred together. There was no sunlight to signal morning. No voices to interrupt the silence. Letters were screened. Phone calls monitored. Every connection filtered until nothing human remained. This was isolation by design, methodical, precise, and unyielding. In solitary confinement, time isn't tracked by calendars. It's measured by thoughts, how long you can hold on to one before it dissolves into another. The routine stayed constant. His mind did not. Sleep and wakefulness began to merge. The boundary between them thinned until it barely existed. The cell didn't torment him with chaos or noise. It did something worse. It repeated itself until the sense of existence itself began to fade. For many inmates, routine offers stability, something familiar to hold on to. For Watts, it revealed a harsher truth. There was nothing left waiting for him. His world no longer expanded or shifted. It only echoed. But what truly breaks a person in isolation isn't the silence. It's what the silence does to the mind. And in his case, the effects surfaced quickly. At Dodge, the outside world goes quiet. What remains is the noise inside, the constant hum of thought when nothing interrupts it. For Chris Watts, that internal noise became everything. It began subtly, losing track of time, forgetting how many meals had passed, questioning whether the lights had changed. Then it intensified, compressing days into a single unbroken mental loop. Psychologists call this cognitive drift, a state where the brain, deprived of stimulation, turns inward on itself. In normal life, people ground themselves through conversation, movement, shared rhythms. Here, those anchors were gone. So the mind created replacements. A guard's footsteps became a clock. A meal tray marked the passage of a day. Weeks stretched into months. And slowly, the line between reality and perception began to blur. Perception begins to thin. The mind starts creating its own movement, faint sounds, brief flickers of light, sensations that feel real for seconds before dissolving into nothing. For most people, this is the point where unease hardens into fear. Thoughts don't slow down, they repeat, circling the one truth that never changes. This will never end. In isolation, time doesn't advance. It compresses. There's no beginning, no finish, only pressure. A punishment that leaves no visible wounds, yet quietly restructures the brain. As the process deepens, a person's sense of self begins to erode. Some forget the sound of their own voice. Others stop speaking altogether, unsettled by the echo of words that no longer feel anchored to anyone. This is the space Chris Watts now occupies, not just confined by walls, but sealed inside himself. At this stage, his punishment no longer relies on guards or locked doors. It's enforced internally by his own nervous system. Every heartbeat reinforces the same truth. Survival here isn't about strength or endurance of the body. It's about mental resistance, with no finish line in sight. And yet, beyond these reinforced corridors, his name continues to travel, searched, whispered, replayed, and revisited. The outside world hasn't let go of him. In fact, it's about to remind him that isolation doesn't erase the past, it amplifies it. Outside prison, Chris Watts is cut off from everyone. Inside, he's never truly alone. Not in the way he would want to be. Within prison walls, every inmate carries a reputation. Some command respect. Others inspire fear. But there is one classification that sits at the very bottom. Those who destroy their own families. From the moment Chris Watts arrived at Dodge Correctional Institution, his story had already arrived before him. Inmates had seen it on television, read it online, heard it retold during quiet moments in the yard. This wasn't curiosity, it was condemnation. Even in isolation, his name moves. Through letters, through transferred inmates, through conversations that pass effortlessly through concrete and steel. The system labels his status as protective custody, but the term is misleading. Protection here doesn't mean safety. It means containment. It's an acknowledgement that if the barrier between Watts and the general population ever failed, the result would be immediate and final. The guards know it. He knows it. Living under that reality creates a constant state of vigilance. A change in footsteps. A different officer on duty. The unfamiliar jingle of keys. Every detail carries weight. When threat becomes routine, suspicion isn't paranoia, it's survival. In other units, inmates constantly test the system, probing for weakness, waiting for opportunity. Watts's life has become a series of calculations. When to move, when to stay still, when to speak, when silence offers better protection. Even a rumor of a transfer or a shared hallway escort can ripple through the population, raising tension instantly. This isn't about revenge. It's about hierarchy. And in that world, harming the most despised inmate brings immediate status. He understands this. Everyone inside does. It's the unwritten law of incarceration, one no policy can override. His punishment is no longer limited to the sentence handed down by a judge. It's the constant awareness that the thin procedural line keeping him alive could disappear at any moment. But that pressure doesn't exist in isolation. Beyond the prison walls, another form of judgment continues to take shape. This one isn't delivered by inmates, but by a world that refuses to move on. For most prisoners, incarceration brings obscurity. Names fade. Stories disappear. Time erases them. For Chris Watts, the opposite happened. Prison made him more visible. Inside Dodge, his identity precedes him. Officers who have never spoken to him know exactly who he is. New inmates arrive already familiar with his face, his crimes, and the family he destroyed. He doesn't need an introduction. His reputation already fills the room, and that recognition extends far beyond the facility. Outside, his case became permanent digital property, endlessly replayed, debated, and analyzed. Every year, someone discovers the footage again. A new viewer watches the interrogation. Another dissects the lies. The cycle restarts. The internet does not forget, and his name is one it refuses to release. Even his mail reflects that fixation. Letters still arrive, some filled with anger, others masked as curiosity. None offer relief. Each envelope is a reminder that his crimes are not confined to the past. They are relived daily by strangers who never met him. In a way, the world keeps replaying his darkest moment, forcing him to live inside it over and over again. Then, in 2020, the attention surged once more. Netflix released its documentary, built entirely from real police footage and personal videos. Millions watched. Within days, the case went viral again, transforming a once local tragedy into global obsession. People too young to remember the original news now knew his voice, his expressions, his deception. For Watts, that renewed exposure became another form of confinement. Isolation was meant to remove him from society, yet society kept forcing its way back in. Every new documentary, podcast, and online debate tightened the grip of infamy. His punishment now exists in two places: the physical walls surrounding him, and the endless digital echo that ensures his story never fades. Because in prison, anonymity is the closest thing to mercy. And that is the one thing Chris Watts will never be given. And anonymity is the one thing he will never be given. Even in complete silence, he remains defined not by who he once was, but by what he did. His name doesn't fade with the years. It spreads. And that constant visibility would soon draw something unexpected into the open. From behind the same concrete walls meant to contain him, a private moment would escape the system and reach the outside world. Proof that his isolation was no longer airtight. Just as public attention began to drift elsewhere, his voice resurfaced. A prison phone call, recorded during routine legal communication, appeared online. Officials described it as unverified, but no one questioned the identity behind the voice. It was Chris Watts. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound defiant. He sounded worn down. Each word moved slowly, as if pulled through exhaustion. Then came the sentence that reignited everything. He said he just wanted to get out of there. It wasn't yelled. It was barely spoken. A quiet admission from a man who once believed he could control every outcome. The recording spread quickly, pulling global attention back to a case many thought was finished. Experts analyzed every pause. Viewers debated the meaning behind his tone. Was it manipulation? Was it regret? Or was it simply the sound of someone reaching the limit of endurance? Inside Dodge Correctional Institution, nothing changed. His routine remained untouched. But outside those walls, perception shifted. People who once believed a life sentence was an act of mercy began to understand what it truly meant, an existence drained of direction or purpose. In that brief audio clip, the world didn't hear theory. It heard the weight of prolonged isolation in real time, measured in breath and hesitation. His statement wasn't a request for compassion. It was a symptom, evidence that repetition, memory, and confinement had begun to erode whatever resolve he had left. Those few words revealed more than years of legal paperwork ever could. That living with full awareness of his actions had become a punishment without escape. The call ended without closure. No farewell. No emotion. Just the dull static of a disconnected line. But its impact traveled far beyond the prison. It reminded the world that while his crimes occurred years ago, his reckoning continues every single day. Later, he would describe that moment not as desperation, but as reflection. And that raised a new question. Was that reflection genuine, or just another adaptation? Another version of himself shaped to survive confinement? Not long after the leaked call reignited public interest, another conversation followed, one that offered the first extended look into his mindset since conviction. This time, it wasn't leaked. It was official. A recorded interview conducted inside Dodge Correctional Institution, intended to address lingering questions from the case. He spoke calmly, steadily, recounting the morning his family disappeared. The drive, the truck, the oil site, each detail delivered without pause, as if recalled from a checklist rather than relived. What unsettled many viewers wasn't what he said, but how he said it. Even while describing moments that should have been unbearable, his voice remained even, controlled, almost unervingly composed. Investigators later noted something subtle but important. His story showed order, not impulse. Each action followed the last with intention. This wasn't a sudden loss of control. It was a series of choices. The divide came later, when the conversation turned inward. He spoke about remorse, about prayer, about wishing he could undo the past. But nearly every expression curved back to himself. He described loneliness, emptiness, the pain of being hated by everyone who once mattered to him. The suffering he articulated was his own. Some listeners heard a man beginning to grasp the magnitude of what he had done. Others heard performance, an instinctive effort to reclaim control of a narrative lost long ago. That debate has never settled. Even investigators who sat across from him struggled to decide. His answers were consistent. His tone unchanged, his posture steady. But consistency doesn't always signal truth. Sometimes it signals rehearsal. For the families left behind, the distinction no longer mattered. Nothing could be undone. For the public, however, a broader question emerged. Can someone like Chris Watts truly experience remorse? Or does a life built on deception eventually lose its connection to honesty altogether? That question leads directly to what remains of his existence now. A life measured not by progress or possibility, but by repetition. Because at Dodge, punishment doesn't end with sentencing. It renews itself every day. As the years passed, another debate surfaced, one not about guilt, but about cost. Inmates sentenced to life without parole don't simply disappear. They become permanent responsibilities of the state. Food, healthcare, supervision, decades of upkeep. For taxpayers, that means millions spent to sustain a man who annihilated his own family. To some, that feels like injustice. They ask why society should finance a lifetime of survival for someone whose victims were denied one. It's a question rooted not just in anger, but in policy, ethics, and the true purpose of punishment. But when the numbers are examined, a different reality appears. The legal system spends far more carrying out executions than it does housing inmates for life. And that reality complicates the very argument meant to condemn him. Every appeal, every review, every safeguard built into the legal process stretches time and cost. In many cases, pursuing an execution consumes far more resources than sustaining a life sentence ever would. But this case was never truly about money. It was about ethics. What does justice look like when it's measured in years instead of currency? Here, justice takes the form of permanence. A punishment that unfolds slowly, across decades. One that forces a man to wake up every day in the same narrow cell, face the same stillness, and accept that there will never be a final date to count down toward. That unchanging reality is the core of his sentence. This isn't mercy. It's accountability extended to its furthest edge. By choosing life without parole, the state removed the spectacle of death and replaced it with something quieter, but far more lasting. A lifetime of awareness. A sentence built not on an ending, but on endurance. And for Chris Watts, endurance is all that remains. While his days repeat in confinement, the lives he destroyed move forward in a completely different way. Shanann's parents and brother exist in a time that doesn't truly progress. For them, justice was never an endpoint. It's a recurring reminder. Every hearing, every documentary, every mention of his name pulls the past back into the present. Inside their home, her photographs remain, not as decoration, but as anchors. Proof that love existed before loss reshaped everything. Her mother still writes to her. Notes that will never be mailed. Because grief doesn't vanish. It transforms. Her father has stepped away from public view. Silence has become his shield. Her brother carries the weight differently, actively protecting her memory from strangers who debate her life online. For them, the world's fascination with this case is both painful and necessary. It preserves her name, but denies them rest. This is the divide no sentence can bridge. Watts's life is defined by routine. Doors closing, lights dimming, days blending into one another. Their lives continue forward. And with every passing moment comes another milestone he erased. Another memory he will never witness. His punishment is confined by walls. Theirs unfolds in open space, quietly, endlessly. In the eyes of the law, justice was fulfilled. The sentence achieved what it was designed to deliver, permanence. But for Shanann's family, permanence means something else entirely. It's an ache without resolution, a story that will never reach a final chapter. No ruling can fill an empty seat at Christmas. No prison term can silence the memory of a child's voice. The justice system can impose consequences, but it cannot heal. It ensures accountability, not closure. For the Razusek family, simply continuing to live has become its own form of justice. A daily act of resistance against what was taken. And as they carry that quiet burden, the world continues to revisit the case, asking what punishment truly means. For those left behind, the answer is both simple and impossible. There is no ending to a loss that still breathes. Each morning, Shanann's family wakes to rebuild what remains of their lives. Each morning, Chris Watts wakes to the same view. Concrete, steel, and the silence of consequence. Their world moves forward. His does not. And that stillness is not mercy. It is intentional. The court removed every element that gives life direction. Parole, progression, anticipation. What remains is a sentence without momentum. It does not count down. It stretches forward endlessly. Days no longer signal change, only survival. Hope isn't denied outright. It's slowly drained until nothing is left. Even anonymity, the quiet relief many inmates eventually receive, will never be his. His name has become permanent. A fixture in true crime history, resurfacing in headlines, documentaries, and endless debate. He will never fade into obscurity. Each reminder of his past locks him into the present, defined forever by the worst moment of his life. Inside that cell, isolation has accomplished what punishment was designed to do. It dismantled certainty. Extended solitude doesn't just remove freedom, it strips away the structure that keeps the mind anchored. The line between reflection and unraveling grows thin, almost invisible. Those who live it describe the experience as being alive, but paused, conscious, yet detached from the world that once shaped them. That is the true design of this sentence. It is not built on pain or finality, but repetition. It does not end suffering. It sustains it. Each hour mirrors the last. Each year renews the same conditions. In this space, accountability doesn't fade with time. It resets every day. Death concludes a story. Life without parole traps it in motionless loops, forcing a person to exist inside their consequences without escape or evolution. And for Chris Watts, that is what worse than death truly means. Not agony, but permanence. A punishment that never allows forgetting, and never allows it to end. A punishment that never allows forgetting, and never allows release. This is the sentence Chris Watts carries now, not marked by violence but by time. A life stripped of milestones, stripped of future, reduced to repetition. No countdown, no transformation. Just the quiet certainty that tomorrow will look exactly like today. For the justice system, this was the balance. Not spectacle, but permanence. Not an ending, but accountability that renews itself every morning he opens his eyes. For the families left behind, justice is something far more complicated. It lives in memory, in absence, in the empty spaces that never refill. Their pain does not reset with the calendar. It carries forward, shaped by love that still exists even when the person it belonged to does not. Nothing in a courtroom can restore what was lost. Nothing in a cell can undo what was done. But justice, in this case, was never meant to heal. It was meant to hold a man inside the full weight of his actions, to ensure that the life he destroyed continues to define the life he must now live. And so the world moves forward, while his does not. Somewhere behind concrete walls, time no longer offers change, only reflection. Every day becomes a reminder. Every night closes without relief. This is not redemption. This is not closure. This is consequence without conclusion. And that is why, for Chris Watts, death was never the harshest punishment. Living was. Thank you for watching True Crime Mysteries HD. If this story made you reflect on justice, accountability, or the cost of human choices, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Stay aware. Stay compassionate. And remember, some crimes don't end when the sentence is handed down. They echo.